Hey folks, welcome to our weekly chat. Thanks again for joining me. Always a pleasure. This week's topic, and I've gotten a lot of topic ideas, and actually I want to thank you. I'm getting more and more people liking the page, following the page. I know a lot of folks watch it after it's been shared on other pages, but the best way really, if you like what you're hearing or want to support this or be notified of what's happening, is to follow or like this page. So I've noticed in the demographics a lot of people are watching and listening, but not necessarily following or liking this page. So you could possibly miss something, because I do post a lot of cool stuff. I think it's cool and I like to share it. Also, with that being said, I've been talking about it for a few weeks now, but this week I will be officially launching the YouTube page that will have all the videos. And thanks for the feedback on that. Some of you have specifically mentioned that you prefer to watch and listen on YouTube rather than Facebook, and so that's been very helpful. And so all the videos will be on YouTube and in a little bit. And if you're watching later, you might see it already. I'll have the link to the YouTube page and the videos and a little more explanation of that. So thank you. This project is growing. In addition to the research I'm doing for some upcoming book projects, this is fun for me, and it's a great way to chat about local history, whether it's East Aurora history or just local history in general. Getting a lot of feedback, people stopping me while I'm out for a walk or in the grocery store. So it's been a lot of fun. So with that said, I have a lot of wonderful ideas coming my way, and so thank you for that. And I don't have enough weeks to keep up with it. So if you've given me an idea, stay tuned, because it will be coming up perhaps in the next couple weeks as I think about it and find the week to put it in, because sometimes I like to correlate the topic with an anniversary or the time period that we're talking, and that's the case this week. I'd like to talk a little bit about something that came up in conversation, and it's timely because of back to school, and unfortunately in the news, COVID is back in the news again. They're talking about the most recent booster vaccine and cases going up a little bit. And COVID is still out there. We're not in the pandemic stage anymore, but it's still out there, and it's regardless of what you think about it, it's in the news. So that's part of the reason this topic came up in a conversation that I had. I'm very lucky to have a couple of friends who are approaching 100 years old. And so one of those folks that I was talking to recently, who's approaching 100 years old, we were talking about COVID, and I actually had known this person and worked with this person during the height of this COVID pandemic, and it always seemed like this person was, I won't say nonchalant, but a little less concerned, just my perception, that she seemed to take the COVID warnings and all those, she just seemed to get along better with what we were being asked to do, the masking and everybody seemed to be, a lot of people were worried about it, rightfully so. And she just seemed to take it in stride more than the rest of us. Still cautious, still paid attention to the recommendations of the health professionals, but my sense was that she just was taking it more in stride. And I had thought, well, maybe it's because of her age. You know, she's older, and she had actually made a little joke that, you know, if she dies at this point, she's lived a long life and appreciated the life that she did have. But she's still going strong. This particular friend, and along with the other ones that I have, a couple other ones that are approaching 100 years old. And so I said, well, you've lived a long life, but I have not. So I'm going to try to keep to avoid getting COVID. But another reason that she said, and as we were talking about it more recently, and she said, well, Rob, I lived through the polio epidemic. And I was like, oh, there's the reason. So she's approaching 100. And she was actually among the age group that would have been parents of young children during the polio outbreaks that were occurring. And when you look up, and I did research, and it's quite funny. I did research. I looked up some of my old articles about and research of. I remember researching polio, and I looked it up, and it turns out I researched it in 2014, so almost a decade ago. And interestingly, I researched the Spanish flu epidemic in 2000 and its relation to East Aurora in 2018, which was the 100th anniversary of the pandemic, having no clue that we would be living something very similar in 2020 and beyond. So this research, I expanded on it in 2020 with our new perspective, and that's what I want to talk about. So this friend of mine's perspective of the COVID pandemic was so different than what most of us and our perspective was, because for us this was the first and only time that we had lived through a pandemic like this. But for her, she had lived, and people of her age, they had lived through it before. And so we sometimes fell into the trap of thinking about and the media said this too, they kept referring to the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. Well, there's no one around. Very few people would be around, or certainly no one who would remember it, who are still around and lived through the Spanish flu epidemic. But we have people who lived through other pandemics that we've forgotten about, unless you've lived it, of course, or unless you have family members. And I've heard about polio. We hear about FDR. I have friends whose parents and grandparents had polio, but it didn't affect us personally. And the epidemic itself. We have the history. We have people who lived through it, but we ourselves did not. So it was very interesting to hear the perspective of someone who lived through the polio epidemic, along with other epidemics, scarlet fever, and their perspective on COVID. So I did a little looking back at polio, and I found that when you Google polio epidemics, you'll often see the official websites, even I think the CDC and some other places that give a description of the polio epidemics. They talk about it reaching its peaks in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, and then the vaccine was developed, which has all but eradicated polio. However, here in East Aurora, it occurred earlier. In fact, there was in Western New York a polio outbreak in 1939, and then another one in 1944. And there were others as well, but those were two that were documented in the local newspapers. And the 1944 one was particularly notable, is because young people were getting what was known as infantile paralysis in the summer of 1944. And it led to health officials and school officials delaying school about a month. Most cases were considered light, and so there wasn't a whole lot of severe cases, except there were a couple severe cases. And in fact, some kids were hospitalized for a period of time in this 1944 case. Of course, there are stories of other times as well. And one young person from Wales, or Westfalls, an 8-year-old in Westfalls, was taken to the hospital, in town of Wales. So Westfalls, a boy was taken to Children's Hospital with polio. And then by the end of August, a young girl in the town of Wales had died. This led health officials, because they knew, statistically speaking, that only about 1 in 10 cases were reported or known. So that meant other people, other cases were out there and spreading this. And of course, this spread similar to the colds and flus that we have. And so I'm talking about all these statistics and why the school officials postponed school, but we forget the element, and this is where my friends who are close to 100 years old, or some of them are younger, might remember as well, is the personal element of of these outbreaks. We just simply don't have a concept of parents being so frightened about a disease that was spreading, and polio was spreading, and the media was covering it. You read about it in the newspapers, and then when cases happened right here in East Aurora or in your small town, we didn't really have a public swimming pool at the time, but parents wouldn't send their kids that summer, particularly, but other summers as well in that period of time, to play with friends. Swimming pools, swimming holes were closed. Kids couldn't go out and play. And that's the element that we don't necessarily appreciate unless we talk to someone who lived through it. The newspapers don't really talk about that. They talk about the numbers of people who went to the hospital. Unfortunately, when young people died of polio, and when school was postponed. But when you talk to somebody who lived through that period of time, you get that fear. You feel that fear that these parents had. And one person told me, and this does make sense to me, that this was different in many respects to other cases because of different diseases. Polio was especially concerning and scary because it affected children. And parents, anybody who's a parent or an aunt or uncle or a grandparent, but parents especially, when your children are susceptible to something like this, it becomes a much elevated concern. And that was what was happening. And also putting it in perspective, so when, like I said, when you read about polio, that you often hear it was at its peak in the late 40s and the early 1950s. But 1939, 1944, the 2 years where it was particularly bad here in Western New York, just the 2 summers that I could find, we were in 1939. We were entering World War II. We weren't involved officially yet, but it was coming. But 1944, we were in the middle of World War II. So perspective-wise, you had families who are dealing with this. 2 things at the same time: World War II and this polio outbreak. And when those 2 came together, that's particularly important when you're studying this history and appreciating what people went through before us. And polio also was much more extended. So yes, we had local outbreaks that were more concentrated in time. But when you look at the difference in that and, the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, actually that was a much shorter time period for us in East Aurora than other epidemics. For instance, and same with the COVID. So COVID tends to be, we're still talking about it, and it was over a very extended period of time, months and months, couple years. But even though the Spanish flu extended for a longer period of time, especially in big cities, really was October, November, about a month here in East Aurora, where we had the theater shut down and places of business closed, restaurants closed, things like that. So it was a much more concentrated period of time. Polio outbreak was several years. And to think that parents were going through this fear up and down until the vaccine came about, of not sending your kids to play, that schools were contemplating this, and thinking about the reaction to it, it just puts it in perspective. So it makes me think, having this conversation with this friend who lived through it, and we all probably know somebody who did, and chat with them about it. What was it like to live as a child, especially if someone was around as a child, or as a young parent? So these folks who are approaching 100 would have been at that age group of being a young parent. If they were born in the 1920s, by the 1940s, they would have been in their 20s. Perhaps parents at the time, what it was like to live through that. And just that fear element, that fear of and how it impacted their life, and how it particularly affected children going back to school and their summer vacations. That was quite a wake-up call for me, and I never really thought of it in that context until we were talking about it. So someone's perspective about COVID, for instance, would be much different had they lived through a previous pandemic. And I'll leave with this interesting tidbit as I was in my perspective changed quite a bit about pandemics. So I was, as I said, I did research on scarlet fever here in East Aurora, the Spanish flu epidemic, and polio particularly, before COVID hit. And it was very abstract. I was researching polio and particularly the Spanish flu epidemic at the 100th anniversary in 2018. And it was very abstract. This is part of history. And trying to get to understand the reaction of people and what it was like to be in their shoes. I recently reread, as part of my research for upcoming book projects, where I'm updating some of the old research that I've done, reread some of that old research that I did. And wow, my perspective is completely different having lived through COVID and reading about previous pandemics. Much different. So, one of the more interesting, not my own writing, but Tom Rosenthal, a friend of mine, Dr. Tom Rosenthal, was working on a book about Jabez Allen, who was an early pharmacist and doctor here in East Aurora. And the Bloodletting and Germs is the title of the book, and it's a historical fiction, so he based the story of loosely on actual historical events, including the life of Dr. Allen. But a lot of the storyline is based off of illness and how they handled disease back in the 1800s, and he talks about pandemics and cholera. Well, I was given the opportunity to read early drafts of the manuscript, and again, it was very abstract reading about this. Well, and the timing couldn't have been more interesting for him. He published the book and started marketing the book around the time the pandemic hit, which was very interesting. He had started the research much earlier than that, and of course that's his career, and that's what he does. That's what he researches, Dr. Rosenthal. But to read that book, both before and after the pandemic, was actually quite surreal. Having lived through COVID, yet again, I have a new appreciation for how disease was handled in the past, and when I read about it, our perspective changed. So even us living through COVID, our perspective is different. Similarly to the friends of mine who are nearly 100 years old, and why now I kind of get why their perspective is different about COVID, because they lived through it. So it's sort of backwards. My perspective about, and our perspective about previous pandemics is different because we lived through COVID. But our friends who are nearly 100 years old, their perspective of COVID is much different because of how what they lived through earlier pandemics. So it's just quite interesting. So to answer the question, polio is why school was delayed in 1944. But more importantly, I think our perspective of history is really shaped on our own experiences and how it evolves. So I'm rereading and re-updating some of the previous research that I did from the new perspective that I have, and it's quite interesting. So again, thanks for that great topic idea, and keep them coming. And again, you can watch this on either on Facebook or YouTube. I'll have these posted on YouTube as well. If you haven't liked or shared the Robert Lowell Goller page, you can feel free to share. Someone asked me the other day, can I share the page or a video? Absolutely. But if you haven't liked or followed the page yet, please do. That's very helpful, and you'll be kept up to date on everything. And again, I am the Town and Village historian, but these videos I do and a lot of the research I do is on my own time, separate from my position as Town and Village historian. So anything I say here does not reflect on the Town of Aurora, Village of East Aurora, or my official position there. All right, thanks. Have a great day, and keep the comments coming. Thanks a lot. See you next time.